Why does the new blacksmith's apprentice only work by moonlight?
Real talk. The link in the description is where the magic happens. Just saying.
What kind of life forces a queen to trade her crown for a hammer? The question lingered in the heavy, heated air of the forge as Callum leaned into the bellows, his broad shoulders tensing with each rhythmic pull. The coals glowed a deep, pulsing crimson, casting long shadows against the soot-stained walls of his mountain shop. He was a man of iron and silence, preferring the predictable song of the anvil to the gossip that clogged the streets of the village below. When the heavy oak door creaked open, he didn't look up immediately, assuming it was a local farmer with a broken plowshare. Instead of the scent of wet wool and manure, a sharp, clean fragrance of pine and cold stone drifted in. He straightened his back, wiping grease from his palms onto his leather apron, and found himself staring into eyes the color of molten gold. A woman stood in the threshold, her tall, athletic frame nearly brushing the lintel. She was covered in a thick, luxurious coat of ash-gray fur that shimmered under the orange forge light, and her pointed ears twitched toward the sound of the dying fire. She carried herself with a terrifyingly beautiful poise, looking less like a traveler and more like a monarch surveying a conquered territory. She did not speak at first, her sharp, elegant features remaining mask-like as she reached into the pocket of her charcoal turtleneck. With a movement as fluid as water, she stepped forward and placed a delicate silver locket on the scarred wooden workbench. The metal was old, etched with intricate filigree that caught the light of the embers. Callum looked at the trinket and then back at the stranger, his low, thunderous voice breaking the silence. He asked her if she was looking for a repair, but she shook her head slowly, her golden gaze never wavering from his. She told him her name was Hestia and that she sought work and a roof over her head, offering the heirloom as her first and only payment. Callum reached out, his rough, calloused fingers hovering over the silver. He could see the way her hand trembled slightly, a single crack in her regal facade. He picked up the locket but did not pocket it. Instead, he pressed it back into her palm, his touch brief and grounding. He told her that a master never takes a student's last treasure, and that if she was willing to sweat and learn, the locket would stay with its rightful owner. The moment of understanding was interrupted by the sharp clatter of crates against the floorboards. Madison, the village's primary courier, and a woman whose energy often bordered on frantic, marched into the shop with a delivery of coal and iron bars. She stopped mid-stride, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of the gray-furred woman standing in Callum's workspace. Madison wiped a stray hair from her forehead, her expression shifting from surprise to a pinched sort of concern. She pulled Callum aside toward the cooling racks, her voice a frantic whisper that carried easily in the quiet shop. She warned him that the village elders were already talking about the shadow scene moving through the trees and that bringing an outsider, especially one who looked like Hestia, into the heart of the community was asking for trouble. Madison glanced over her shoulder at the silent apprentice, nodding that the people were uneasy and looking for reasons to be afraid. Callum merely nodded, his face a stony mask of indifference. He thanked Madison for the supplies and watched her leave, her hurried footsteps echoing a warning he had no intention of heeding. As the sun dipped below the jagged mountain peaks and the village lights flickered to life in the valley, Hestia began her first night of work. Callum handed her a heavy rounding hammer, expecting her to struggle with the weight, but she took it with a practiced, effortless grip. He watched, fascinated, as she stepped to the anvil. Her technique was not that of a novice. It was precise, rhythmic, and devastatingly efficient. She moved with a dancer's grace, her muscular frame coiled, and then exploding with power as she struck the glowing steel. Each blow landed with a perfect, ringing clarity that surpassed anything Callum had seen from his previous human assistants. She didn't waste a single motion, her ash-gray fur catching the sparks like falling stars. It wasn't just labor to her. It was a ritual. Callum found himself leaning against the brickwork, mesmerized by the way she commanded the space. She wasn't just an apprentice learning a trade. She was a leader who had been stripped of her people and was now reclaiming her strength through the fire. The heat of the forge eventually became too much, and they retreated to the small wooden porch that overlooked the dark expanse of the valley. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant coming of rain. Callum brought out 2 bowls of thick stew and a loaf of crusty bread, handing one to Hestia. They sat in a comfortable silence for a long time, the only sound being the wind whistling through the eaves. Finally, Hestia spoke, her voice a soft, melodic rasp. She confessed that she was from a fallen northern pack, a lineage of rulers who had lost everything to a bitter internal coup. She told him she wasn't looking for power or revenge, only a place where the weight of her bloodline didn't dictate her every breath. She wanted peace, something the frozen wastes of her home had denied her for years. Her golden eyes reflected the distant stars, filled with a heartbreaking, silent dignity that made Callum's chest tighten with an unfamiliar ache. Callum watched her as she ate, noticing the way she tilted her head to catch the sounds of the forest. He had spent his entire life in this village, surrounded by people who knew his name and his father's name, yet he had always felt like a ghost haunting his own life. Looking at this displaced queen, this woman of fur and fire, he realized with a jolt of clarity that he felt more at home in her presence than he ever had at a village festival or town meeting. There was a shared frequency between them, a resonance of 2 solitary souls who had built walls to survive. He didn't see a monster or a stranger. He saw a kindred spirit who understood the weight of silence. He reached out, his hand resting on the porch railing near hers, not quite touching but close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her skin. He told her she was safe here, and for the first time since she had walked through his door, a small, genuine smile touched her lips. The peace of the evening was a fragile thing, brittle as over-hardened steel. Callum knew the village elders wouldn't let the matter rest, especially not with Madison's warnings ringing in his ears. He looked at Hestia's profile, the way the moonlight turned her ash-gray fur to shimmering silver. She was a creature of the wild and the refined, a paradox that the simple folk below would never be able to comprehend. They feared what they couldn't control, and Hestia was the definition of uncontrollable. He thought about the iron he had shaped today and the way she had handled the hammer, her strength a silent promise of protection. He felt a sudden, fierce urge to shield her from the narrow-mindedness of the valley, a protective instinct that went beyond simple hospitality. He was a man who worked with heat and pressure, and he could feel both rising in the world around them, threatening to melt the sanctuary he was trying to build. As they stood to head back inside, a low howl echoed from the deep woods far to the north. Hestia froze, her ears pinning back against her head and her golden eyes narrowing. It wasn't a sound of distress, but a call, a reminder of the world she had left behind. She looked at Callum, a flash of vulnerability crossing her features before the regal mask slid back into place. He reached out and squeezed her shoulder, his hand heavy and reassuring. He told her that the forge was still warm and the doors were bolted tight. She nodded, her posture straightening as she stepped back into the orange glow of the shop. Callum followed her, the scent of charcoal and hot metal wrapping around them like a shroud. He knew the coming days would bring challenges he couldn't yet name, but as he watched her pick up the tongs to clear the hearth, he knew he would face them. The blacksmith and the wolf were no longer just master and apprentice. They were 2 points of a new constellation, burning bright against the gathering dark. The following morning, the heavy timber door of the forge swung open with a violent creak, admitting a draft of mountain air and the stern presence of the village council. Emma, a woman whose face was as weathered as the granite cliffs surrounding the valley, led the small delegation with an air of grim authority. She didn't bother with pleasantries, her sharp eyes scanning the soot-stained walls until they landed on Hestia. The apprentice was currently hauling a heavy sack of anthracite, her gray fur dusted with black powder, but she didn't flinch under the elder's scrutiny. Emma turned to Callum, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and command. She explained that several farmers had reported a massive predator prowling the treeline near the goat pens, a creature that moved with unnatural speed and left tracks too large for any common wolf. The village was on edge, and the elders had decided that a passive defense was no longer enough to keep the children safe. Emma stepped closer to the primary anvil, her finger pointing at the iron surface as if demanding the metal itself to testify. She ordered Callum to begin immediate production on a specialized, heavy-duty trap, one plated in high-grade silver to ensure that whatever beast haunted the periphery would stay down for good. At the mention of the precious metal, Hestia's posture shifted instantly. Her spine went rigid, and her ears twitched back against her skull in a display of suppressed tension. She didn't drop the coal sack or offer a protest, but the air around her seemed to vibrate with a sudden, cold electricity. Callum noticed the way her knuckles whitened as she gripped the burlap, her golden eyes fixed on a point somewhere deep within the cooling embers of the hearth. He felt a knot of conflict tighten in his gut, but he gave Emma a curt, professional nod, promising to prepare the materials for the grim task. Once the elders retreated into the daylight, the silence in the shop became thick and suffocating. Callum moved to the central furnace, signaling for Hestia to join him at the main workstation. He needed to distract her, and himself, from the dark request. He pulled a thick billet of steel from the flames, the metal glowing a vibrant, dangerous cherry red. He instructed her on the delicate art of folding the steel, a process requiring perfect synchronization between the lead smith and the striker. As he guided her hands to position the heavy tongs, his rough, calloused fingers brushed against the soft, dense fur of her forearms. The contact was brief, but felt like a jolt of lightning through his system. He could feel the lean strength of her muscles and the heat radiating from her body, a warmth that had nothing to do with the roaring fire nearby. They worked in a rhythmic dance of hammers and heat, their breath sinking as they pounded the impurities out of the metal. The workday ended with a sense of looming dread that Callum couldn't shake. He headed down to the village market to collect a shipment of borax, only to be intercepted by Madison behind the grain silo. The courier looked more frazzled than usual, her hands trembling as she clutched a clipboard to her chest. She leaned in close, her voice a frantic, low-pitched hiss as she scanned the area for eavesdroppers. Madison told him that the whispers in the village had turned into a roar of suspicion. The people weren't just afraid of a predator in the woods anymore. They were beginning to link the arrival of the mysterious, furred apprentice with the sightings of the beast. She warned Callum that if he continued to harbor Hestia, the elders might decide that the blacksmith was just as much a threat as the creature they were hunting. Callum felt a surge of hot, protective anger, his jaw setting firmly as he told Madison to mind her deliveries and leave the politics to him. Returning to the forge, Callum found Hestia standing by the open window, staring out at the darkening forest with a look of profound weariness. He didn't hide what Madison had said, laying out the village's growing hostility with blunt honesty. Hestia turned to him, the orange light of the dying fire casting long, elegant shadows across her face. She finally spoke of the world she had fled, describing a palace of ice and the intricate betrayals of a royal court that had seen her family slaughtered for their progressive views. She explained that she was the last of a sovereign line, a princess of the north who had been hunted across 3 borders by those who feared her bloodline. She wasn't a monster, but a refugee of a war the humans would never see. Callum listened, his heart heavy with the realization of the burden she carried. Her dignity wasn't an act of arrogance. It was the only thing she had left of a kingdom that had turned to ash. As she spoke, Callum realized that his loyalty was shifting away from the village that had raised him and toward the woman standing in his shop. He saw the way she held herself, the quiet power in her movements, and the deep, soulful intelligence in her gaze. She was more than just a talented apprentice or a curiosity to be feared. She was a person of immense worth who had been discarded by her own kind. He felt a fierce, primal need to stand between her and the world that wanted to cage or kill her. His reputation as the village's dependable smith felt like a flimsy, unimportant thing compared to the weight of her trust. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers on the workbench, offering a silent vow of sanctuary. He wouldn't let them turn his craft into a weapon against her, no matter what the elders demanded or what the cost to his own standing might be. The following morning brought the reality of his predicament to his doorstep in a way that couldn't be ignored. A heavy wooden crate was delivered by two of the village men, who left it on the threshold without a word, their eyes averted. Callum pried the lid open with a crowbar, the screech of pulling nails echoing through the rafters. Inside, nestled in protective shavings, lay several thick ingots of pure, refined silver. The metal didn't glow with the inviting warmth of copper or the sturdy reliability of iron. Instead, it cast a cold, clinical, and almost sickly light across the floorboards of the shop. It was a beautiful, lethal material, shimmering with a moonlight luster that felt like a direct insult to the woman standing just a few feet away. The presence of the silver changed the atmosphere of the forge, turning the air metallic and sharp, a physical manifestation of the betrayal the village expected Callum to perform. Hestia walked over to the crate, her eyes fixed on the gleaming bars. She didn't pull away in fear, but her lip curled in a faint, regal sneer of disdain. She knew exactly what that silver was intended for, and she knew the skill Callum possessed to turn it into something inescapable. She looked from the metal to Callum, her expression unreadable, waiting to see if the man she had begun to trust would succumb to the pressure of his peers. Callum looked at the silver, then at the heavy hammer he had used to teach her the trade just the day before. The orange glow of the forge seemed to dim in the presence of the cold white metal, creating a visual divide in the room. He could feel the weight of the village's expectations pressing down on his shoulders, a heavy, invisible yoke that demanded he choose a side before the next full moon rose over the valley. Callum lifted the first ingot of silver, the metal feeling unnaturally cold against his palms despite the nearby heat of the furnace. He placed it onto the anvil with a dull, hollow thud that seemed to echo through the rafters like a funeral bell. Hestia stood near the grinding wheel, her tools forgotten in her hands. She did not speak, but the way she watched the shimmering bars was a physical blow to his conscience. Her expression was one of profound, heartbreaking disappointment, as if she were witnessing a betrayal she had expected but hoped to avoid. The pride that usually defined her posture seemed to fray at the edges, her shoulders slumping just a fraction as the silver caught the flickering orange light. Callum wanted to explain that he was only following the motion of the trade, but the words died in his throat. The silence between them grew jagged, cutting through the mutual respect they had forged over the anvil. The heavy door groaned on its hinges as Emma stepped inside, her boots clicking sharply against the stone floor. She ignored the soot and the rising heat, her focus entirely on the silver resting on the anvil. She looked at Callum with a hard, uncompromising stare, her hands clasped tightly behind her back. "We are counting the days, Callum," she said, her voice sounding like dry parchment rubbing together. "The farmers are losing sleep, and the livestock are being slaughtered in the dark. I expect that trap to be finished and tested before the next full moon crests the ridge." She glanced toward Hestia, her eyes narrowing with a suspicion that was becoming increasingly difficult for her to mask. The elder didn't wait for a response, turning on her heel and leaving a trail of cold authority in her wake. The pressure she left behind was a physical weight, a demand for a sacrifice that Callum wasn't sure he could make. As the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, the usual rhythm of the forge broke. Hestia did not take her place by the secondary hearth to work by the silver light of the moon as she usually did. Instead, she retreated into the deep, velvet shadows of the back storage room, where the crates of raw iron were stacked high. Callum watched her go, the absence of her presence by the fire making the shop feel cavernous and hollow. The trust that had been growing between them, as fragile as spun glass, was visibly fractured. He could hear her shifting in the darkness, a restless packing sound that reminded him of a caged creature. She was no longer his partner in the craft. She was a ghost in his own house, silenced by the metallic threat he had allowed into their sanctuary. Every time he looked at the silver, he felt like a stranger to himself. Callum tried to focus on the fire, pumping the bellows with a frantic energy, but the flames seemed to mock him. The coal hissed and sputtered, refusing to reach the brilliant white heat necessary for a clean weld. His heart simply wasn't in the work, and the metal sensed his hesitation. Every strike of his hammer felt clumsy and lacked the intentionality of a master. He He was used to creating tools that built lives, plows, horseshoes, and hinges, but this task felt like a descent into cruelty. The heat of the forge, which usually offered him comfort, now felt oppressive and suffocating. He wiped a hand across his brow, leaving a smear of grease and ash, and realized that his hands were shaking. The art of the blacksmith was supposed to be about transformation and strength, not the construction of a jagged, silver-toothed prison for a living soul. The following afternoon, the quiet of the mountain was shattered by a frantic shouting from the valley below. Madison arrived on horseback, her mount lathered in sweat and wide-eyed with terror. She didn't even wait to dismount before crying out that a massive wolf had been spotted near her own farm, packing the perimeter of the goat pens in broad daylight. The village was erupting into a defensive frenzy, with men arming themselves with pitchforks and old hunting rifles. Madison's face was pale, her eyes darting toward the forge as if she expected the walls to burst outward. "They're coming for it, Callum," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They think you're stalling. If that trap isn't ready by tonight, they won't wait for the silver. They'll just start burning the woods." The panic was infectious, a rising tide of fear that threatened to drown the small, peaceful life Callum had built. Hestia emerged from the shadows once Madison had fled, her movements slow and deliberate. She walked toward Callum until she was standing directly in the path of the furnace's glow, her ash-colored fur illuminated by the dancing flames. She looked at the unfinished silver mechanism on the bench and then directly into Callum's eyes. "Do you truly believe a cage can solve the problems of the fearful?" she asked, her voice a low, melodic rumble that vibrated in the air. Her gaze was steady, challenging him to look past the iron and the silver to the truth of the situation. She didn't plead for her life or ask for mercy. She spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had seen empires fall to the same kind of cowardice. Callum realized then that the villagers weren't just afraid of a wolf. They were afraid of anything they couldn't control or understand. The realization hit Callum with the force of a sledgehammer. The silver trap wasn't just a commission from the council. It was a definitive test of his loyalty. He was being asked to choose between the safety of the village that had provided him with a home and the life of the woman who had provided him with a purpose. He looked at Hestia's regal face, seeing the intelligence and the sorrow etched into her features, and knew he could never be the one to bring her down. To forge this weapon was to destroy the best part of himself. However, he also knew that if he refused outright, the village would take matters into their own hands, and Hestia would have no chance at all. He had to play a more dangerous game, one that required the precision of a jeweler and the cunning of a fox. Callum turned back to the anvil, his movements suddenly certain and fluid. He beckoned Hestia closer, signaling for her to take up the heavy striker hammer. "I'm going to forge it," he said, his voice a low thunder that brooked no argument. "But we are going to change the recipe." He began to explain his plan in hushed tones, describing how he would alter the chemical composition of the silver alloy. By adding a specific ratio of tin and lead hidden beneath a thin, shimmering veneer of pure silver, he could create a metal that looked lethal but would become brittle and snap under the slightest pressure. It would be a masterpiece of sabotage, a weapon designed to fail at the exact moment it was needed most. Hestia watched him, a slow understanding dawning in her golden eyes, and for the first time in days, she reached out and placed her hand over his on the handle of the tongs. Together, they turned toward the fire to begin the work of deception. The finished contraption sat upon the central workbench like a dormant viper, its jagged teeth gleaming with a deceptive, polished luster. Callum stood back, wiping a thick layer of soot from his forearms, watching as the morning light caught the silver plating he had painstakingly applied over the brittle core. To any untrained eye, it was a marvel of lethality, a heavy-sprung jaw designed to snap shut with enough force to sever bone. He had spent the entire night ensuring the hinges looked tight and the trigger appeared hair-sensitive, though he knew a single sharp kick would shatter the internal pin he had cast from a weak, porous alloy. His chest felt tight, a knot of anxiety twisting in his gut as he realized there was no turning back from this silent insurrection. He had crafted many things in this forge, but this was the first time he had ever forged a lie. Hestia emerged from the back room, her belongings gathered into a small, waxed canvas satchel slung over her shoulder. She did not look at the trap, keeping her gaze fixed on the doorway that led toward the darkening timberline. Her ears were pressed flat against her skull, and her tail remained tucked close to her legs, a posture of profound resignation that cut Callum deeper than any blade. "I cannot stay to see the end of this," she murmured, her voice a hollow rasp that seemed to drain the warmth from the room. "You have given them what they asked for, and in doing so, you have told me exactly where I stand in your world." She moved toward the threshold with a fluid, mournful grace, her footsteps making no sound on the packed dirt floor. She believed the shimmering metal on the table was a testament to his betrayal, a silver seal on her death warrant. "Wait, Hestia, please," Callum said, stepping forward to intercept her, but she sidestepped him with a flash of teeth that wasn't quite a snarl but carried a warning nonetheless. He reached out, his fingers brushing the coarse, soft fur of her arm, feeling the frantic heat radiating from her skin. "You have to trust that the smith knows his metal better than the buyer," he pleaded, lowering his voice until it was barely a vibration in the air. "If you run now, they will hunt you with dogs and rifles before the sun sets. Stay in the high caves near the waterfall and wait for my signal." He saw a flicker of hesitation in her amber eyes, a momentary break in the wall of ice she had built around her heart. She didn't offer a promise, but she didn't pull away immediately either, searching his face for a sign of the man she had worked alongside for weeks. The arrival of the village elders cut their moment short as the heavy oak doors of the forge swung wide. Emma marched in, flanked by two sturdy men from the council, her eyes immediately locking onto the silver trap. A grim smile touched her thin lips as she ran a gloved finger along the serrated edge of the metal. "You've done well, Callum," she noted, her voice dripping with a cold, predatory satisfaction. "I knew the pressure would bring out your best work." She signaled to the men, who hoisted the heavy device between them, their faces set in masks of righteous determination. They didn't even glance at Hestia, treating her as little more than a piece of furniture as they carried the engine of destruction out into the bright afternoon. The village was moving with a singular, terrifying purpose now, a collective fear that had finally found a focal point. By dusk, the village assembly had gathered at the edge of the northern clearing, a place where the shadows of the pines grew long and distorted. Emma and the elders oversaw the placement of the trap, burying the base in the soft needles and covering the silver jaws with a light dusting of leaves. Callum stood on the periphery, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He watched as they retreated to the safety of the treeline, clutching lanterns and old hunting tools, their breaths hitching in the chilled mountain air. The silence of the forest was oppressive, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or the distant hoot of an owl. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, a slow crawl toward a confrontation that would either save Hestia or expose his deception to the people who called him brother. He slipped away from the group under the cover of the gathering gloom, circling back through the dense undergrowth toward the high ridge where he hoped Hestia was hiding. He found her perched on a lichen-covered boulder, her silhouette sharp against the rising moon. "Hestia, you have to listen to me," he whispered, gasping for air as he scrambled up the slope to reach her side. "The trap is set, but it is a hollow shell. If something steps into it, the metal will fail." She looked down at him, her expression unreadable in the silver light, her ears twitching at the sound of a distant metallic clatter from the valley floor. "I have spent my life watching the traps of men, Callum," she replied, her voice heavy with a weary wisdom. "They rarely fail by accident." He grabbed her hand, his rough, calloused palm pressing against her velvet-furred knuckles. It wasn't an accident, he told her firmly. It was a choice. A sudden, piercing howl echoed through the canyon, followed immediately by the sharp, rhythmic clanging of the village alarm bell. The sound was frantic and jagged, signaling that the trap had been sprung. A massive shadow had been seen thrashing in the clearing, a dark shape that the villagers were already screaming was the beast. Callum and Hestia looked at each other for a heartbeat, a shared moment of terror and hope, before they both began to run toward the noise. As they broke through the final line of trees, they saw a circle of flickering torches surrounding the trap site. The villagers were cheering, their voices a cacophony of relief and bloodlust, as they surged forward to claim their prize. But as the light of the torches hit the center of the clearing, the shouting died down into a confused, murmuring hush. In the center of the silver jaws lay a common mountain lion, its tawny fur matted with dirt, but it wasn't pinned by the metal. Instead, the cat was standing over the shattered remnants of the trap, which had exploded into a dozen dull, gray fragments upon impact. The silver plating had peeled away like cheap foil, revealing the brittle, sandy texture of the failed alloy beneath. The mountain lion, startled by the crowd and the light, leaped over the broken machinery and vanished into the darkness of the woods before anyone could raise a rifle. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma stepped forward, kicking a piece of the broken metal with the toe of her boot, her face contorting into a mask of cold fury. She turned her gaze toward Callum, who was standing at the edge of the light with Hestia at his side. "This wasn't a mistake," Emma hissed, her voice carrying across the clearing like a whip. "You sabotaged this, Blacksmith. You chose a monster over your own kind." Hestia did not retreat into the trees as the accusations hung heavy in the mountain air. Instead, she stepped forward, her tall and athletic frame unfolding to its full, commanding height. The flickering orange torchlight danced across her ash-gray fur, catching the sharp, elegant lines of her face as she moved into the center of the clearing. Her presence was not that of a cornered animal, but of a displaced queen reclaiming her throne. She looked at the elders, her golden eyes reflecting the fire with a piercing, steady intensity that made the nearest men take a reflexive step back. When she spoke, her voice was a melodic chime of silk and steel, carrying over the murmurs of the crowd with effortless authority. She asked them if their homes were so fragile that the mere existence of something different required its destruction. She spoke of the ancient laws of the mountain, reminding them that fear was a choice, while honor was a duty they had clearly forgotten in their haste to spill blood over a broken machine. The weight of her words seemed to press down on the assembly, stifling the angry shouts that had begun to rise. Emma opened her mouth to retort, but Madison stepped out from the cluster of villagers, her face set in a look of firm defiance. The courier looked at the council members, her hands planted firmly on her denim-clad hips. She told the crowd that she had spent every morning at the forge for weeks, watching Hestia work until her hands bled and her muscles ached. Madison pointed toward the forest, declaring that while the village spent its nights whispering in the dark, Hestia had been acting as a silent guardian, her presence alone keeping the true predators of the high peaks away from the livestock. She testified that the apprentice had shown more loyalty to the safety of the valley than those who had lived there for generations. The courier's voice didn't waver, providing a bridge of human trust that Hestia's regal alienness could not build alone. Callum felt a surge of pride that warmed him more than any hearth fire. He moved to stand shoulder to shoulder with Hestia, his heavyset frame a solid anchor against the swirling tension of the night. He looked directly at the elders, his calm and observant gaze sweeping over the faces of neighbors he had known since childhood. He stated clearly that his days of forging weapons born of paranoia were finished. The forge was a place of creation, not a factory for execution. He placed a steady hand on Hestia's shoulder, the coarse texture of her fur familiar and grounding beneath his palm. He told them that Hestia was his partner in every sense of the word, a master of the craft who had earned her place at the anvil through sweat and skill. He made it known that if the village could not accept her as she was, then they would have to find someone else to mend their plows and shoe their horses, for he would not work without her. The silence that followed was different this time. It was the quiet of a storm passing rather than one gathering. The council members looked at the shattered silver on the ground, then at the two figures standing defiant in the clearing. The absurdity of their terror became apparent in the face of such quiet, unwavering dignity. Emma's shoulders slumped slightly, the rigid lines of her posture softening as the collective bloodlust of the village began to evaporate into the chilly night air. One by one, the men lowered their torches. They saw not a beast, but a woman who had worked beside them in silence and a man who was willing to lose everything for her. A tense, fragile peace settled over the clearing, a mutual understanding that the world was changing and that perhaps, for once, the change didn't have to be violent. The elders turned away without further threats, the crowd dispersing into the shadows of the pines. As the last of the lanterns faded into the distance, leaving only the silver glow of the moon to light their path, Hestia turned toward Callum. The tension left her frame, replaced by a soft, weary grace. She reached into the neckline of her charcoal turtleneck and pulled out the silver locket she had carried since her arrival. She didn't look at it with the same reverence she once had. Instead, she looked at Callum. She told him that the locket represented a past that was gone, a relic of a fallen pack that no longer defined her. She placed the cool metal into his soot-stained hand and asked him to take the silver, the very material that had symbolized her fear, and transform it. She wanted him to melt it down and forge it into a simple band, a circle that would signify their bond and the new life they were building together in the heat of the mountain forge. They walked back to the shop in a comfortable silence, the crunch of dry needles beneath their boots the only sound in the vast, sleeping forest. When they reached the heavy oak doors, Callum didn't head for his living quarters. Instead, he went straight to the hearth. He pumped the bellows until the coals glowed with a fierce, inviting orange light that chased away the cold, blue shadows of the moon. The familiar scent of wood smoke and hot iron filled the air, a scent that felt like home for both of them. Hestia shed her satchel and stepped toward the anvil, her movements fluid and purposeful. The fear that had clouded their work for the past week was gone, replaced by a shared clarity. They were no longer master and apprentice, nor were they hunter and prey. They were two souls who had found a common rhythm in a world that often lacked harmony. The work began with a synchronized grace that required no words. Callum held the crucible over the heat, watching as the silver locket lost its shape and became a shimmering liquid, purified by the intensity of the flame. Hestia stood ready with the small finishing hammer, her golden eyes focused on the glowing metal as it was poured into a narrow ingot. When the metal was ready, they moved together. The sound of their hammers striking the anvil was a perfect, unified cadence, a heavy pulse that echoed through the rafters of the shop. Each strike was a testament to their resilience, a rhythmic declaration of their presence in the valley. The sparks flew in a golden rain, illuminating Hestia's ash-gray fur and Callum's rugged features in a constant, flickering halo of light. There was no hesitation in their movements, only the steady, confident flow of two masters at work. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the jagged horizon, the silver band was finished. It sat on the anvil, cooling into a dull, honest luster that didn't need the deceptive polish of the trap. Callum picked it up, the metal still warm, and looked at Hestia. The solitary life he had led for nearly 40 years felt like a distant memory, a shadow that had been burned away by the forge fire. They stood in the quiet of the morning, the roar of the fire fading to a gentle hum as the shop settled into the peace of a job well done. Outside, the village was waking up to a world that looked exactly the same as it had yesterday, yet was fundamentally altered. Inside the forge, two people who had once been strangers to the world and to themselves stood together, ready to face whatever the mountain decided to send their way next.